Evan, I was wondering if you, for the folks who haven't yet had the opportunity to read the book, if you could give us kind of an overview or a bird's eye view of what you cover.
Sure. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for having me in this wonderful space. And at least we have beer, regardless of how informative or entertaining this conversation is. When I pitched this book to agents who then pitched it to editors, the working title was The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. And I wrote the book and submitted it and kept waiting for some publicist or marketer to say we need to talk about the title. And they never did. And I don't know if it was just they neglected it or not. And so the drawback of the current title is that it's not creative or snappy or fun. But it is very clear. And so I really don't have much to say about what the book is other than the title, which is that it's a survey of the bookstore as an institution, what it's meant in American life and times and American culture. And it's very backward looking insofar as I'm also trying to grapple with why these institutions are so vital and important spaces and what we've lost or what we potentially lose every time a bookstore closes.
And was it a surprise to you at all to have this become an instant New York Times bestseller? I mean, how did you, I guess maybe a better question is, how did you decide that this was the time for this book? Or was it a surprise that many other people also seemed to think, yes, this book is right for right now?
My wife can back this up. My editor, the New York Times bestseller list come out Wednesday at 7 p.m. online. They show up in print sometime thereafter, considerably later. And at about 4:48 Eastern time, I get a call from an unknown number in New Jersey. So they're very sketchy for a variety of reasons. But I was actually in Washington, D.C., scheduled to do an event at Politics and Prose that night. So it occurred to me that maybe somebody was calling in regards to some schedule change. But it was my editor, and she said, "You made the New York Times bestseller list." And even now, I'm sort of getting shivers about it. I think I said something stupid like, "Are you sure?" Or really? But there was also a kind of, I think, deafening pause, or it felt like things slowed down. So it was a complete shock, not just for this book, but for just me as a human being who thinks about popularity and success, and that list in particular, as being something, lunar in kind of its proximity to me. So it was amazing. And in my proudest sense, I would like to think it has something to do with the book. But I'm going to read it as actually more about the appetite for what readers have and a celebration of bookstores more broadly. And there were a couple of people who emailed me after it made the list who said, it made them feel really good about the state of publishing and reading, that some middling nobody could actually crack this list that's chock full of mostly celebrities or people who are famous with a book about bookstores that I think most people, including myself, wouldn't have seen coming. So I think that's a kind of there's a lot of positivity that we can all take from that.
Does it change your life to be on this list? What is it like living with the after effects of having a hit book?
Well, I'll say I'm definitely famous now. I didn't finish the sentence. If you compare my fame to what it was in July, I'm considerably more famous than I was 4 months ago. But compared to famous people, I'm not famous. So people like to ask me this question. Somebody here tonight, I won't say who, Andy Perrine, just asked me if my ego was being inflated. And this is the most common question that Amanda gets fielded, or fields. She says no, that I don't feel famous. It feels like something just happened and this weird thing. But I do ask Amanda frequently, especially when the New York Times list came out, questions that made no sense. Sort of like, what is happening? Can you explain? I was asking her to explain how I should feel a lot of the time, because I was confused. But I was just in New York City, and I went into a half dozen bookstores, and I saw my book everywhere. It was in the windows, on tables, and yeah, that's really surprising and weird and rewarding, and I get a lot of joy from it. And I'm trying not to take it for granted, because I still just feel like this is my third book. I've written 2 books. I guess it's my first book if you only count books that people read. But I remember what it was like to write those books, and it felt very satisfying to write them to some degree. And I did derive some satisfaction from talking about them. And I got invited to a couple of talks, and 7 people read them. And, and that felt great. And I'm worried now that if my next book is not as successful, what kind of standards I'm setting for myself. I'm getting into a very deep psychological kind of session here, but there is this question of how to sort of enjoy the ride, so to speak, and celebrate what is a very surprising success, but also balance that with this feeling and drive and need to do it again. And now, unlike my first 2 books, this book was a commercial book. I had a literary agent, I have an editor at a big publishing house. So they have expectations as well about what's coming next.
And your previous books covered bicycles, the history of bicycles?
Yes, they were essentially about how bicycles altered the urban landscape in various times and places within the United States. Yeah.
What do bicycles and books have in common? This isn't a joke. This is
well, both subject matters stemmed from my own personal interest, and there are some academic historians here in the audience today, and they can maybe confirm this, but we're taught to be very distant from our subject matter, to be these supposedly objective readers of the past. And historically, history was about periods long before the historian lived. But I never got into that. And I approached history from my own personal interest. And I was living in New York City, crisscrossing the grid on my bicycle, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. And I was aware that there are other places in the world in which bicycles are much more popular, in which the landscape encourages rather than discourages cycling. So the historian in me was essentially asking what is a very common question that many of us have about the kind of lack of cycling culture. Why? And there are some obvious kind of main level answers that people are familiar with. But it seemed to me so important. And I loved riding the subway and figuring out the best exit to get out of the subway, which train car to be in, which stairs to ascend, which exit to get out on the southeast corner of 16th and 6th. And I thought about this kind of, this puzzle, this grid. And so many of the choices that we make feel like they're our own, that we have agency, but they're really in many ways scripted by the choices given to us, in which some mobilities are advantaged over others. So I will say the similarity to bookshops was I had lived through this great decline in the number of bookstores. And that wasn't necessarily evident to me that had to have happened, that was inevitable. And I had a personal interest with my wife, then girlfriend, who worked at a bookshop in New York. So both of them planted the seeds for me thinking about how we got to where we are. And they're both things that I had a real love for. And in my ideal neighborhood, city, country. This is a place with lots of bicycles and bookstores.
I'm sure you did a great deal of research, of reading, of visiting bookstores across the country. And I'm wondering how you shaped all of that information into this arc that you've created for us. And what, if anything, you might have had to cut out.
I don't know how I did this in a way, and I don't mean that facetiously. Sometimes, I teach students here at JMU, graduate students, and they'll ask me about my method, my sort of research methodology. And I can talk to them about some very kind of essential or fundamental skills that we historians teach our students. But in terms of kind of sifting through evidence, taking notes, deciding what's going to be in the narrative, having a good sense, because I will say, even though nobody read the first two books, they were helpful insofar as I got a much better sense along the way of what the book was going to be in the end, which is useful even at the beginning in terms of efficiency, in terms of figuring out what you need to look at and what maybe you can let go. But it's a kind of jungle. My notes and files and archives, it feels to me very messy, and I would be terribly embarrassed to show anybody. And my method is I like to start writing fairly early on. So I'll go to an archive. There's a bookseller that I know I want to profile, go through their papers, take a bunch of notes, and from those notes try and write paragraphs, pages on this person and figure out what I'm going to do with it later, but really work closely from the source itself at the beginning and then weave a narrative on top of that. So that really wasn't a good answer or a clear answer. But I will say one of the best feelings of publishing a book is a kind of sigh of relief about the administrative management of intellectual data that I've accumulated, some of which lives in my brain, some of which lives on note cards, some of which lives in Word documents, some of which are photos, that it can be a lot. And that's the real challenge of writing a book versus an article or something like that. So it feels so good to just send it away and feel like, not that I want my house to burn, but if it did, my book is fine.
Sorry, that just sent me down like a little rabbit hole.
I always keep a print every month or two. I'm working on a book. I'll print out a whole version of it and I keep it in the freezer, which is something that my father-in-law did with his dissertation that he told me about back in the 1970s. And it's apparently useful in case there is a fire, but it's also a good reminder to stop eating so much ice cream.
I love that. So I was really enjoying reading your book, and I was learning so much. We started with Ben Franklin. We go through Oscar Wilde and Drum and Spear, and then I got to the chapter on Amazon, and suddenly I'm having an existential crisis because I'm wondering what even is a bookstore, because you recount Amazon books and how they had brick and mortars and they had shelves and they had books and they sold the books, but the feeling was off. And that just kind of got me wondering, what is it that makes a bookstore itself?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, well, there's a technical answer to that question. So the United States Census defines a bookstore as any retail outlet that sells at least 50% of its revenue is comprised from books. But that's not a very good answer. And there's no perfect answer. And the answer changes over time. So some of the first bookstores, even though they were selling lots of books, didn't feel like bookstores, weren't meant to be browsable spaces, and weren't what we would think of as a bookstore. And later on, there were places that maybe sold a bunch of books, but were multifunctional, and they were also printers, and they were very loud, and lots of things were going on. So they also didn't feel like bookstores. So, it's a kind of cop-out answer to say, like a Supreme Court justice once said about pornography, you know it when you see it. But essentially, I think that's true. And the Amazon chapter was the most difficult to write. So when I was pitching this project, it's the one that agents and editors had the most questions about. How are you going to write about Amazon? And I think there was a kind of fear also of besmirching Amazon, or, this is such an important seller that you didn't want to piss them off too much. And also they, of course, aren't known for having physical bookstores, and the book itself is profiling all of these different actual bookstores, brick and mortar shops. So I decided to sort of keep that typology and profile these brick and mortar Amazon bookstores, of which there was a couple of dozen. The nearest one to here was in Bethesda, Maryland, which I went to. And write about those and why they didn't work, as a way to also talk about why Amazon as the company works, at least financially. And they were very weird stores. They had some good qualities about them, I will say, but mostly not. And the one in Bethesda, there's an image somewhere in the book, depending on your angle, there were times in which you would see no books, just waffle irons and Alexa devices and whatnot. And I wish I had a picture here to show, but they also had this Amazon store, my favorite section of all time that I've ever seen in a bookstore, the mystery, thriller. And there were some Amazon specific ones like, 4 stars and above or whatever. But then they had a whole bay of books that was titled, If You Like Nonfiction. And I thought, why not just call it nonfiction? It was a series of nonfiction books for people who if you like nonfiction. And this was like the most kind of, this was before ChatGPT was popular, but it sort of felt the same way. Like, what world? This is like something that I just can't quite articulate how backward this is. And like, was this created by a human being? Because it seems hard to imagine. And they felt soulless, which is why they didn't succeed.
One of the things that struck me the most about that chapter was 25, the woman who is in charge of, she does all the research and she sets everything up, and she's, there have been focus groups and they're taking feedback. And so it's very like automated, very business. And then there was a line where she says something about they felt bad about the books that were spine out and not face out. And I was like, you've almost got it. Like, you almost know what you need to do. But like, even there, it was like, there's a glitch in the matrix. Like, she almost, almost gets it.
Yeah. So this person, the first, 100 Amazon employees became better known by the number employee they were to work at the firm. So this woman, who is obviously very successful, having been the 25th employee, but it's very smart. And to what you're speaking to, this kind of theme, so many of the people in charge of Amazon and the Amazon bookstore in particular were bookstore lovers, super smart people, heavy readers, the kind of core demographic of many bookstores. So there were kind of signs or suggestions and even elements of the ultimate design that I think bore fruit and made sense and worked well. But fundamentally, the culture of the company itself was, I think, too powerful of a force and showed through in the feel of the bookstore.
Yeah, I think too, there's part of what makes a bookstore so important, not to try to answer like one of the questions of the book, but like it's also those like the physicalness of that book object that I think you also talk about. People feel uncomfortable at the thought of throwing a book away. There's a reverence to it. Even having, as you say, books in a house where children are growing up, like, has an effect on their intellect and what they're interested in. So I was wondering also what your spark book was.
My spark book? Yes, being surrounded by books matters. There's books behind me, right? That's partly a design choice, but it also suggests something, or maybe can be comforting, cozy, but also inspiring. And I wish there were more books in our world. And there's nothing more powerful feeling than walking into a great library or bookstore. And I used to live in New York. And if you ever go to the main branch on 42nd Street, the reading room, you can't help but want to be a scholar. And you can't help but sort of be curious. And I think the same is true for the best bookstores that you want to read them. For me, I was a kind of troubled child. No, I don't know. I wasn't a huge reader in elementary and middle school, or I didn't love it for the most part. And even now, I think I wish I didn't read all the books that I read. So I just read James, the new Percival Everett book that's a remake of Huck Finn. And I thought it was fantastic. But I was also regretting not really remembering Huck Finn. Or I think I hated Huck Finn when I read it because I was in middle school and I didn't understand it. I hardly knew anything about American history at the time. So looking back, I'm like, I should have read Huck Finn at a much more mature time. So I'll blame it on my middle school English teachers, who were not nearly as good as our current middle school teachers, one of whom is my son's teacher, who I saw earlier. But I'd say I got much more, and this is going to sound very kind of cliche for somebody of my generation and male, but I really started liking Kurt Vonnegut and reading satire and comedy appealed to me and probably lots of other teenagers for some obvious reasons. And I just read through, 5 or 6 of his books and then started going to the library more often and expanding from there. But I had never been assigned funny material and sarcastic and kind of deeply smart, but dark. And that's my preferred direction.
I'm sure your book tour has taken you lots of exciting places. And I was wondering, I'm sure people come up to you continually to talk to you about their bookstore moments. In the introduction or the first chapter, you talk about the magic moments, these kind of moments of synchronicity when a customer walks up to the bookstore owner and asks for a book, and it turns out the author is standing right there. So I was wondering if you could share any stories that you've collected along the road.
I just had this, I will say one of the nice things about writing a book that some people read is that some of these people will even reach out to me as the author, and that's been really great. And most of them say, "Dear Evan, I really thank you for writing this great history of the bookstore. You're such a capable storyteller, but," here it comes. "But I can't believe you didn't mention Fill in the Blank Bookstore. And I grew up at Fill in the Blank Bookstore. And my mom took me and we rove the aisles of Fill in the Blank Bookstore. Fill in the Blank Bookstore has been here for 35 years. It's one of the most important independent bookstores in the country. How could you leave out Fill in the Blank Bookstore? Please consider writing a sequel." So those have been very fun interactions for the most part, especially the first paragraph. I'm smiling and then it turns to okay. But I'm glad people are reaching out. I did have this is a kind of maybe getting too much into the weeds, but there's a story in the book. One of the most fascinating characters is this guy named Bert Britton, who worked in the basement of the Strand in the 1970s for the most part. That's when he became famous. He actually first went to the Strand in 1963, the day after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And he was feeling depressed and walked into the Strand bookstore which he discovered that day. And it was a kind of refuge for him. And he would go back and back and back year after year. So eventually the owner said, why don't you just start working here? And he becomes the kind of public face of the Strand. He works in the basement and he's in charge of the review copies. So when a book gets published before the publication date, the publisher will make what they call galleys or advanced readers copies that they send out to the newspapers and some booksellers in order to generate buzz before the pub date. But a lot of those people, like let's say you're the editor at the New York Times, you're getting every major book is being sent to you and you don't need all those books. So they would go down to the Strand and sell them to the Strand for 25% of the list price. And then the Strand would sell them to consumers for 50% of the list price. So still a good deal for a book that's new, even if it wasn't perfect, because sometimes there are typos and things that get fixed. So he was in charge of the review copy section, which was one of the most prominent sections in the basement. And he became a kind of celebrity in his own right and befriended Norman Mailer and Saul Bellow, Kurt Vonnegut, and many others by just working in the basement. And he eventually wrote his own book. Well, didn't really write it, but he assembled this book that was a collection of self-portraits of famous authors. And people would come in and he would ask them to draw. Joan Didion drew herself as text. She said something like 5'4", too thin or something. But most of the people actually drew their figure. And he eventually made this into a book called Self-Portraits of Authors. And the Strand hosts this legend, may have been the greatest sort of assemblage of American authors of all time for this guy who worked in the basement and made like $10.75 an hour. Anyway, I write about this book and this character in my book. And somebody on Instagram messaged me and says, he's from Tennessee, says, I really loved your book. Thanks so much for writing it. And by the way, and he shows me a photo of Bert Britton's book. He said, I wanted to get a copy of this book, and my wife did too. And he sends me this photo. And it was from the Strand. He happened to be visiting the Strand. And I happened to be in the Strand the same day. Lo and behold, he said this to me the day after. And I gave a talk at the Strand. And because this person came up at the end of the event, the owner of the Strand gave me a copy of this book. So that's a kind of very long story for not too big of a payoff. Didn't quite get there. But it did feel like one of these, like when the person sent me this, at first it was, all right, I like your book. All right, thank you, But then there was this kind of, connection that felt special to me.
I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll everyone prepare your audience questions. I know that we have lots of historians and bookshop lovers out there who are getting ready to pepper you with all manner of questions. But as I was reading your book, I got to the end and I love the depiction of Ann Patchett at Parnassus. And you mention Davis Kidd Booksellers, which was my bookstore growing up. And I am the kind of person who keeps lots of ephemera. So I went into like my bookmark haul, and it turns out that I have a bookmark from old Davis Kidd. This is where to make us kids be good, we did lots of chores. And if we did enough chores, we got a book at Davis Kidd. And so I went through my bookmark haul and I pulled them all out and I'm like, oh yes, Davis Kidd, Dixon Street Bookstore in Fayetteville, Arkansas, Maple Leaf Books in New Orleans. And so it sent me down this beautiful kind of memory lane. And it also made me want to cancel my Amazon Prime and immediately go and support my local bookstore. Local bookstores! So I'm wondering, what, having read this book, what do you want your readers to do?
Well, first thing I'm thinking is I think my kids should have to do chores. Their mom owns a bookstore. So they think they just go to the bookstore and pull something off the shelf and they're like, this is mine, right? it's hard to say no to a kid in a bookstore. I will say that there are many worse things they could want to buy. I'm not. I don't like telling people what to do. I mean, behind their back maybe, but not explicitly. But I do. The point of the book is to help people realize how important bookstores are and have been. And so I think if we can appreciate the role that bookstores play as anchors of community, as intellectual spaces, as places to gather, as places to lose oneself, as places to learn, as places to read and see and touch books, that these are special spaces. They're unlike any other kind of retail outlet. And that's what I want people to take away. And then what they do with that and what their behaviors, how their behaviors may change, that's for somebody else to sort of weigh in. But hopefully we can all sort of appreciate how magical, magnificent, wondrous, and influential these spaces are, and can be.
Thank you. All right. If y'all will raise your hands if you've got questions, and then I'll repeat them so that our audiences can hear them. Yeah. So, the power of books, your ability to kind of illustrate that power that books have over us, and a lovely story about a child wanting to be put into a book.
Yeah. Great question. Thank you.
All right. I see a white shirt in the back. Nice. So, e-readers, yay or nay? And were you inspired by Seinfeld?
First of all, I think the Seinfeld book, which was obviously a joke, is a great idea and brilliant. And so there is an obvious appeal to writing a book about books or bookstores. So I didn't actually make that connection yet, but I think it's a genius idea. In terms of ebooks, I generally like to say, was your girlfriend here? Okay. They don't compare to actual books. And I think you should be reading, that's what I tell my children, that, I'd much prefer you to not read on a screen and read a real book. But I do think that people listening to books, people reading ebooks, is a lot better than not reading at all. And so I appreciate that people have different tastes and styles and lifestyles and ways of learning. For me, I'm just a print book kind of person. And when they made the audiobook of this, they sent me 5 samples of voice actors, and I got to pick my preference. And I thought they sounded crazy. All of them. They're like, and the book was sitting on the table next to the water. These very drawn out. And I was like, next. And then I got to 5 and that was all gone. And so I did some fact finding and talked to people and realized that the problem was me. I just have never listened to an audiobook before, period. And that there's this style of, enunciation and pause and drama. And so, I appreciate that there are lots of other ways of consuming books, and my own way is just one, and I stick to the actual physical book.
Did you end up listening to the audiobook recording of your?
No.
He did a good job.
Okay. Yeah, I picked him because he's the one who sounded most like me, slightly boring and less drama than some of the other ones, but he seemed like a swell person. And the weird thing is when you write a book, you never consider what the audiobook version will be like. So there were a lot of questions about pronunciations of people's names who were not famous, who lived 200 years ago. And I often had no idea. And then there were a couple of times when I referenced the reader. So back to the point about pissing people off for omitting their favorite bookstores. I acknowledge that up front and say, some of you are going to be upset. You're going to go to the index. You're going to look for your favorite bookstore. Don't be mad at me. And then I sort of say the fact that you are upset is part of my story because you care about this institution so much. But I say to you, dear reader, and then the audiobook people were like, we got to figure something out because they didn't want to call the listener a reader and they make some minor edits and there are these kind of distinctions. So this is a very, I don't want to say existential, but at least philosophical question about what a book is and what it means to be, to read. And I'm not going to weigh in, or I'm not an expert fully on that subject.
Yes, in the front.
Well, my favorite bookstore is Parentheses Books. Which is, if you haven't been, is a beautiful bookstore just across from Magpie Diner with a great curation of books and a very educated and friendly staff full of readers. Yes. I like so in New York City, and I was just there, there's like 5 of them called McNally Jackson in New York City. And there's 2 branches in particular, one in South Street Seaport and the other in Rockefeller Center. And they're both stunning visually, amazing lighting, homey feels, creaky floors, brick, carpet. It's just a kind of perfect balance of design. But they also both have books that I've never seen elsewhere. So it's a combination of having, they're big stores and they have all of the current popular titles and the books that most people want, but they also have some esoteric stuff and weird stuff, and you can dig around. So it's a combination of both being this stunning and yet comforting physical space, but also feeling like it's a portal into really a kind of almost cabinet of curiosities. Like there is just so much stuff here that I'm not familiar with, and that's exciting. I like that question. I originally had proposed, when I pitched this project, of writing about college bookstores, campus bookstores. And I think that's a really fascinating story because they used to be, before I was in college, really the intellectual hub of many colleges. And I did some preliminary research at Harvard, which has this very famous cooperative bookstore, and reading through some of the materials from the 1940s, this all-male school, and the brochures were like, here's what you have to read, and here are the sport coats you need to buy. And it was all about how to become a kind of Harvard gentleman. But the literature was essential, not just books, but the right kind of books. And they even put out all of these lists about the kind of books one needs to read to sort of be the brand of this institution. So I was really fascinated by that. And I, of course, now teach at James Madison University, a fantastic institution, all great. And yet I have this desire, this very evil, sinister desire, which now I'm saying publicly, so this might get me in trouble if this ever happens. But I have thought of, not seriously, but just in my imagination, taking a can of spray paint, going to the JMU bookstore, and over the word bookstore, putting quotation marks. It's a lovely space where you can get, every size you want of hoodie and tote bags and whatever else. But to me, as a faculty member, it's a depressing space. And to think about, I don't know what that particular space or its predecessor was like at Madison College, some time ago. But I do know that a lot of universities, These were places that hosted lectures, talks by the faculty, visiting faculty, places where people went like they go to other bookstores to actually find new books. So that's a kind of fascinating evolution or devolution that I initially thought about writing about and including in the book, but it just didn't make it in.
All right, over here.
So a question, not so much about bookstores, but your process of getting to Penguin Random House. How did you get an agent? How did your agent? Can you explain that? It's very hard to get an agent now.
Yeah, I don't know how. I was told that it's almost impossible. And I was just at my agent's office because I was in New York and that's where most of publishing still lives. And I was talking to my agent's assistant. She works at some big firm and they all have administrative assistants who are Ivy League graduates themselves who weed out the first gatekeepers in this process full of gatekeepers. And I said, how many submissions do you actually forward on to the agent to consider? And she said, well under 1 in 100 that the agent will even look at. And she was like, I know that's depressing. I said, that's the greatest thing I've heard. Tell me it's 1 in a million. Because I was just that one person. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any contacts. I have 7.8 social media followers total. I have nothing. I have no platform. I have no brand. I'm not particularly good looking. I'm just a guy. And I had this idea and I just sent it out to agents and somehow a few of them were interested. And then I just picked one and I thought that was a miracle. And then she pitched it to editors and Viking, which is part of Penguin Random House, bought it. And that seemed like a miracle. And at that point, like at that day when we sold the book to Viking, it didn't seem to matter to me that seemed like success at that point. So then the fact that people are reading it, and I'm here now. Yeah, it's just amazing. And lots of people have asked me that, for tips, and I wish I had better advice. I maybe there's just some hope for people that you can be sort of not famous and not have a platform and not know anybody. It's a long shot, but it is possible.
Yes. How are your students reacting to your celebrity?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I've had to cancel class once or twice to go somewhere, and they seem to be all in on on that. There's the students in the sort of the non-majors. I'm not sure if they all know or not. Some of them do and have mentioned it, and I try and, we have like a history association within the department, and I gave those students a bunch of copies of the books so they could have, when they seemed interested in it and were asking about it. Yeah, I don't know. You have to ask them. I don't like talking to them about it. It feels like, there used to be those professors who assign their own book in their class. And, I guess that was a kind of thing, or maybe still is. I don't know. But I feel weird just being up here talking to you about my book. They're on sale there. Some people are going to buy them. I'm like, are you sure you want to buy it? It's $30. And, I don't want to, deplete Mary's sales here. You should buy it. It's a nice coffee table book. But there is some, I'm a historian and a scholar and writer, and I feel that identity more so than in terms of talking to people about it and giving interviews, which is part of it. And I don't dislike, but it does feel odd and sometimes uncomfortable.
Is there anyone in the back? Yes.
Oh, well, as a book lover and a bookseller, I love your book. Loved it. But aesthetic of the book. What did you get any input on the cover? I think it's a fantastic cover. I think it's gorgeous.
Well, thank you.
But did you get? I know some authors do, but some authors don't.
Yes.
And if anybody doesn't, this is Susan, who's the manager at our local Barnes and Noble, or a assistant assistant to the regional manager, whatever it's called, a bookseller, the owner. I'm not sure what her title is, but
She's a very important reader.
yes, but she's a legend over at the local Barnes and Noble. And a lot of times people will ask me at these talks about Barnes and Noble and the kind of quote unquote war between independents and Barnes and Noble. And I have a whole chapter about Barnes and Noble in the book. And what I usually say is that whatever, tensions existed have long dissipated, as Barnes and Noble and the indie booksellers are largely allies in a fight against Amazon to preserve brick and mortar bookselling. And so the fact that Susan is sitting next to Amanda is, I think, the perfect testament to this point. So the cover I love as well. Typically, so Penguin Random House has a whole art director and design team. And typically they will produce 3 or 4 covers that they then show to the author and agent to pick and discuss. In this case, they only showed me one, and they claim, and I have no reason to not believe them, but my editor said that the PR people and my editor, the publicist, the marketer, they all really liked this one. So I essentially just had it up or down. They asked me if I liked it or not. And if not, they would show me the other versions. And I loved it. So I was really happy with it. And I have nothing to do with it. I didn't even make up my own name. that was given to me. I guess the title, the boring title, is the only thing I came up with. Yeah, and it was important to me to have an attractive book as somebody who's writing about bookstores, and knew that this would be the kind of book that would, skew more toward in-person bookstores, and wanted to be the kind of book that would attract people and eyes. Thank you.
All right. What do we say? Let's give them a hand. Aran, Center for the Book, and Evan, thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing all of your comments and your fabulous questions about this fabulous book. Thank you again. I want to thank everyone for coming out, and let's give them another hand.